So if you were to tell me a step process, would you say step number one, identify a nation that has a lot of resources that we need, that we can monetize, that they're not doing well financially? Would you say that's step number one?
Yes.
Okay, what's step number two?
Step number two is to send somebody like me and an economic hitman in to convince the president or the minister of finance or whoever's in control that they need to accept a huge loan from the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or one of these organizations, and use that money to hire U.S. corporations to build big infrastructure. So
in there, oh, got it.
So you do a study to show that if they invest, let's say a few $1 billion in today's terms into building an electric system, you show that for the next 20 years, the economy is going to grow at a pretty high rate.
Got it. So number one, identify nation. Number two, go send somebody like yourself, a chief economist, aka economic hitman, to meet with the Ministry of Finance or the PM or the president, whoever it is, the main leader, and tell them, we can go to World Bank and get a loan for this much money and have American business create infrastructure in your country, and that's going to create a lot of jobs, and it's going to benefit you. And in that conversation that you're having with them, is that a forced conversation, or is that a butter, smooth, amicable, everyone's going to win? What kind of a conversation is that?
You just asked the key question, Patrick. So you go in and you're armed with a very sophisticated report that your financial experts, the guys who work for me, we produced econometric models, fancy, mathematical models to show how everything would benefit, how much industry would grow, and how much, so on and so forth. You go in and you hand this to the president, and you basically say, hey, Mr. President, if you take this loan on, and it's going to really benefit you and your family and all your friends, because your family and your friends own the industries. They own the banks. They own the commercial establishments. And all of those are going to benefit from infrastructure. Oh, and by the way, our construction companies are going to hire your brother-in-law's firm that happens to lay pipe. and your sister owns the John Deere franchise. We'll run a lot of John Deere equipment, and we'll pay top dollar for it. We're not going to try to negotiate her down. We're going to negotiate her up. In fact, you end up often, let's say, paying $2 million to rent equipment that should only cost you $1 million. It's a bribe, but it's a legal bribe. Nobody can find you fault if you made a lousy decision and paid too much. In practice, nobody's even going to look. But if they did, you'd get out. So all these ideas. Oh, and incidentally, Mr. President, you and all your ministers and your cabinet, all of their children are going to get scholar. We're going to help them get into colleges. My company was in Boston, a lot of good colleges. We had a lot of contacts. We're going to get them into the best colleges in Boston area, and we're going to give them full scholarships. And we're going to give them jobs during Christmas vacation and summer. And when they get out of college, they have guaranteed jobs with us. These are bribes. But actually, we went out and we talked to the press, the Boston Globe, the Boston media, and we said, hey, we gave $1 million last year in scholarships to kids from poor countries. We don't mention that those were the kids who didn't need the scholarships. But so there were all these, there were very strict anti-corruption laws in the United States in those days, and I guess there still are. But there's so many ways to get around them, and we knew all those ways to get around them. So you go in and you tell the president this. You say, so buy into this loan. And he says, but we're going to take on this huge debt, and it means we're going to have to take money away from education and social services and healthcare to pay the interest on the debt. And we say, yes, but you're going to make a lot of money, you and your family. So he knows that he's doing something that's probably not going to help his people, but it's going to help him. And then you also say, but if you don't choose to take if you don't choose to take this deal, remember what happened to Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. Remember what happened to Salvador Allende in Chile. Remember what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala and Diem in Vietnam and Lumumba in the Congo. These are all presidents or prime ministers who refused to play the game and were taken out in coups or assassinations. And so basically we're saying, remember, there's people we call jackals behind the scenes. So basically I'm saying, hey, Mr. President, in this hand, I'm offering you a lot of money for you and your friends. But and if you choose not to take it, in this hand, I got a gun. No, I didn't actually carry a gun, but I knew those guys were basically CIA assets. behind me that had guns. And, you know, the classic case, the original case was Kermit Roosevelt, who overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran and replaced him with the Shah. And that set a precedent. And these presidents all know this. They know the history. They know they will be taken out. So what's the choice? You know, Patrick, what would you do?
Let me ask you, when you are saying it, how are you saying it to me? Like, I know the way you just said it right now. How would you say it to me if I'm the Shah of Iran and you're sitting with me and you're telling me, here's the options? If you could role play with me, what would it be like? How would you say it?
Yeah, first of all, with the Shah, we didn't play quite that game because he had plenty of money. He didn't have to take a loan. We were just trying to convince him that he ought to work with us rather than the Soviet Union. That he ought to, you know, we wanted his oil, and we were willing to help him westernize his country, and he didn't want to go the Soviet route. So that was a little bit different.
We'll get to that in a minute. Give me an example of somebody who you did.
So let's say I'm talking to you. You're the president of Colombia.
Okay.
And we want to get at your resources there. And I'm saying to you, I'm showing you all these fancy reports that show how well your country's going to do. And you can show these reports to your press and to your people. You can convince your people that by taking on these loans, you're helping the country. You're going to build these big dams. You're going to build these big electrical systems, whatever. So you get all the material you need here. And it's usually a series of meetings, maybe some of them over lunch with a few cocktails, et cetera. And the president's maybe electing a little, and then you just sort of subtly start talking about, somehow you bring up the topic of what happened recently to Salvador Allende in Chile, or what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala. Depending on what part of the world you're in, you talk about these people and you say, you know, isn't that a shame? And you talk a little bit about this. And, you know, depending on the president, different presidents, you approach differently. But they get it. I mean, they know the history. It doesn't, you know, these guys know what's going on, and their advisors know what's going on. And they're usually sitting there at the meetings too, some pretty smart advisors who've probably, you know, been to business school, the same business schools that I went to and so forth. And everybody's, you know, I speak Spanish, but most of the people in the room can speak English too. And they get, you know, they get the same background. But I will say, Patrick, and I talk in the book about two presidents who did not play the game. Democratically elected president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos. They had tremendous integrity. They saw what I was trying to do, and they didn't do it. And they understood the dangers they were taking, and they talked about these things. And both of them were, I believe, assassinated. They were both taken out in almost a little over 2 months apart from each other. In 1981, they were taken out in their private planes in Ecuador first, with Jaime Roldos. His private plane crashed, very suspicious circumstances. And less than 3 months later, same thing happened to Omar Torrijos in Panama. These were the only two guys that stood up to this, that said, we're not buying these deals. And in fact, made a big point, public relations. They went out there and made very strong statements, and they set examples for the world. And they were taken out in these plane crashes. And although there was never a smoking gun found, because in a plane crash, the smoking gun goes up in smoke. Plane crashes, private plane crashes are the best way to assassinate someone if you ever decide you want to do that. And because of the evidence is gone. But in the case of at least one of those cases, Jaime Roldos, the plane's engines were sent to a laboratory in Switzerland, and they concluded that the plane had not crashed; it had blown up in the air. And so, and there was tremendous other evidence. There's tremendous evidence that points to these having been assassinations.
How much longer were those assassinations after you sat down with them?
Well, with Omar Torrijos, I'd been sitting down with him since the mid-'70s. And this happened in '81. So this had gone on. He'd meanwhile negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty with Jimmy Carter, which turned the canal over to the Panamanians at the end of the millennium. And Roldos had only been president for a couple of years. So it had been a fairly short period with Roldos. Roldos died first. He was a lawyer. He was a college professor. He'd run on a campaign platform of forcing the oil companies, and that was Texaco from the United States primarily, to pay a fair share of its profits that it made from Ecuadorian oil to the Ecuadorian people. It was a pretty reasonable thing. And he said, if they don't do it, I'm going to nationalize them. And of course, the oil companies didn't like that. And I couldn't talk him out of it. I couldn't talk him to take these deals. And he goes down in this plane crash. Right after that plane crash happened, Torrijos got his family together, and I know some of the pimpers that were there personally, and said, my brother, Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, was just assassinated by the CIA, and I'll be next probably. But he said, don't worry about it, because I've accomplished the biggest thing that I wanted to accomplish, and that is I got the canal back in the hands, and the canal zone back in the hands of Panamanians. I successfully negotiated that contract, so I'm ready to go. And he stuck to his guns. Well, that was a poor turn of phrase there. He got taken out. But very few presidents had that kind of guts or insanity, and it still goes on. I mean, presidents of these countries are in very, very, very difficult positions.
So let me ask you this. So if we go back to the system, number one, identify the nation that qualifies for what you're looking for. Number two, go in and get a loan from a World Bank and create businesses there and jobs. And in return, we're going to take care of your kids. We're going to put them at Harvard. We're going to put them at Brown. We're going to put them at Columbia. We're going to put them at Yale. Full ride scholarship, all this other stuff. You're going to be fine, and we're going to pay you some kind of an income. Number three, if you don't, here's what could happen to you that happened to the following 6, 7, 8 people. That's the business model. Is that pretty accurate what the business model is?
Yes, up until that point, yes.